Is it? Okay. When my one records, it like has this really weird robotic voice, which is like, this event is now being recorded. But I haven't heard that, but I presume it is actually recording. And that's just some weird Exeter thing. So welcome everyone to the book dialogue with Steven Klein and myself. Steven Klein is a lecturer in political theory at the Department of Political Economy in King's College, London. And I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. So I was going to talk first about Steven's book, and then he was going to talk about mine. And then to make sure that we had a bit of dialogue going, we were then going to have a brief reply each, followed up by some more general discussion with other participants today. So we're both super excited about this. And because it's political theory, there's no need for slides. There's none of that. It's just all, you know, pre-prepared, on-point discussion from the participants, so that, you know, well, let's just throw that idea that there's going to be any PowerPoint presentation. That is not how things are done in political theory. It is what I have to do every day for my students, but that, you know, now I'm freed from those shackles. So I'm gonna jump right into it. I'm really interested and excited to discuss Steven's book. So I'm going to launch right in, because the fundamental challenge of the book is how welfare institutions such as unemployment insurance, healthcare, and job guarantees could be thought of as the site of a transformative politics. So rather than turning to extraordinary moments outside of the daily reproduction of everyday life, the book is asking us whether the seemingly ordinary and mundane has been for too long overlooked as a meaningful field of political action. So this is kind of how the book begins. The book diagnoses a wrong turn made by Weber and a legacy inherited by democratic theorists that conceives of welfare institutions as routine, technical, and completely absent of democracy and politics. The book is a historical reconstruction of political thought and practices that seeks to provide useful resources for further democratizing our welfare system. So through theoretical reflections on three main theorists, which are Weber, Arendt, and Habermas, and historical sections on the German SPD and the Swedish feminist movement, the book shows how welfare institutions can become sites of political mobilization and objects of political judgment and critique. So if the book had a slogan, and this is actually a line from the book, this isn't just me inventing slogans for someone else's book. If the book had a slogan, it would be putting the democracy back in social democracy. So this might not be a line you would see spray canned onto a broken police car or sung from the barricades or anything like that, but it does have a super important insight that I think can be found in the book, and that is that welfare institutions should not only ensure our well-being and provide a social support, but they should also be a site of collective democratic empowerment and participation. So we're used to thinking of welfare institutions as constructing passive and docile recipients of benefits and as containing this Kafkaesque bureaucracy of social security. And I think we're less inclined to see the sphere of the social and the kind of social reproduction as a potentially powerful force for political contestation. And so the central argument of the book, I think, has both an incredibly pragmatic on the one hand and utopian on the other dimension to it. So first, it points to the importance of political struggles over really core social policy issues that have such a profound effect on many people's everyday lives. And so on the one hand, it's calling for this immediate and constant struggle on this front. On the other hand, it calls on us to rethink and reimagine how we could collectivize social risk and organize forms of social security in new and empowering ways. So most importantly, though, it envisions this as a site of collective political struggle for social movements, for the elected officials, and for the civil service that is going to be part of delivering these services. So the book is an incredibly rich theoretical work. So there's a lot of it that I just can't really do justice in this really short presentation, right? So to give you an idea of the ambition and the scope of the text, the first chapter constructs a new theory of domination. And it's one that attempts to integrate insights from neo-republicans, from critical theorists, and from post-structuralists, all of these three into a single account of domination. So this domination has three different dimensions. From the neo-republicans, we get an idea of direct forms of interpersonal domination. From the neo-Kantian critical theorists, we get an idea of structural domination of certain groups over others through their power to shape social norms. And finally, from the post-structuralists, we get an idea of abstract domination, of how individuals are constituted as responsible subjects. So needless to say, none of these three groups is probably very happy about having their account of domination kind of being planked in as one tiny part of a much larger project. But there are interesting challenges and provocations for those interested in these accounts of domination. And I can't do all the technical stuff because I really want to focus on some of the other interesting political questions. So after this first chapter, where there's this really rich, almost Hegelian account of domination, of like everyone has a partial perspective, but now we see the greater whole. The real question of the book is how precisely can welfare institutions be opened up to democratic intervention? And perhaps more precisely, what strategies could social movements adopt to use welfare institutions to transform structures of domination in society? So I think that is the core problematique of the book. Like, how do social movements respond to this? How can they transform these structures of domination? Now, so to make some of this theory more concrete, we can turn to one of the two main historical studies of the text. And I'm going to turn first to the SPD, because that is the opening vignette of the book. And so we can see that it has a certain importance to its author. And so this is the SPD, the German Socialist Party of the 19th and 20th century, the SPD's response to Otto von Bismarck's passing of social insurance laws in 1883. There is also another section on the Swedish feminist movement in the next chapter, but here I'm just going to focus on the SPD. So these laws that were passed were about providing financial support for workers when they were sick. It's an interesting example because for Bismarck, these reforms had absolutely nothing to do with guaranteeing the social welfare of workers. He absolutely was not interested in that aspect of it. They were simply a political tool to win people away from support for the socialists. Nevertheless, once it was passed, this was the first national system in the world. And we can see it as one of the first really important steps towards the European welfare state. And so what does the book make of this example? I think what really matters isn't Bismarck's intention to win workers over to monarchism, but it's the response of the Socialist Party. It's how a democratic collective sought to negotiate the inherent contradictions and tensions of the welfare state. So the socialists aim to use these new welfare institutions as instruments for further agitation and organization. Yeah, if everyone could just mute themselves, that would be great. So how did this? So the book shows that this occurred on two levels, right? So first, in terms of, firstly, it happened in terms of a starting point for more radical demands. And secondly, it was about showing how these new institutions could be used for practical organizing and mobilizing. So there's a kind of discursive and a practical element. So firstly, at the level of political discourse, the SPD advocated for what was a kind of radical reformism. Their aim was to accept the material gains provided by the new laws while continuing to push for more radical demands and attempting to reframe the new institutions in the public's mind, not as instruments of insurance for specific individuals, but as collective forms of social power and solidarity. So there's a discursive kind of move there in their attempt to reframe how we should think about these new laws. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the appointment of workers to various boards that were established to administer these schemes also provided the party and the socialist movement with an important beachhead for the development of workers' power within the state. On a very practical, everyday organizational level, there were thousands of positions within these institutions that became important associations and sources of power and legitimacy from which to organize further action. So this is really like a concrete example of precisely how the book kind of see some of these tensions and forms of political contest around the welfare state. So I've got three main points of dialogue between the book and some of the work that I've been doing. So the first point is about the relationship between history and theory. The analysis in the book of the SPD and of the Swedish Feminist, of the Swedish Feminists is a great example of a historically grounded political theory. And the stated intention in the book is that it's seeking to move back and forth between concrete historical examples and then reflection on conceptual categories. And I think it does a really good job of kind of having these chapters that each chapter kind of has a short history section and it's really interwoven in. It's not like they're these two separate things that aren't connected. So I think the book prompts us to consider what is the role of history and historical examples in political theorizing. Is history meant to provide an example of a theory in action? Does it provide the sort of raw material from which a historically grounded theory could be constructed? Or alternatively, is history a kind of testing ground for whether different theoretical schemas can be proved either true or false, or perhaps a less strong test would be at least useful guides for action? So in this case, the narrative of the SPD's reaction to Bismarck appears in the middle of a chapter on Hannah Arendt. And so the argument of this chapter is that Hannah Arendt's theory enables us to see welfare institutions as what the book calls worldly mediators, which is to say welfare institutions are occasions for people to come together and make political judgments about socioeconomic matters. And this is a kind of position that's ascribed to, it's a kind of against the grain reading of Arendt. And so the lessons that the book hopes we will draw from the example of the SPD are quite Arendtian in nature, and which is to say, it emphasizes the socialist creation of new worldly sites of public appearance and judgment, and the opening up of unforeseen horizons of democratic action. And it's at this point that the Muldoon senses start to tingle, because I think what seems to fade a little bit into the background is the explicit goal of the workers' movement at the time, which was to bring about a socialist society through the abolition of wage labor and all forms of exploitation. And so there's a slight tension in the chapter between an Arendtian political project on the one hand and a socialist one on the other. And I think it kind of resonates with me a little bit because I think Arendt does something similar with her own work on the workers' movement in On Revolution and the Human Condition. So there is this interesting kind of tension between theory and history and the attempt to bring them together. And so I think this observation leads me to a second point, which is about the political project of the book. And so I think another title for the book could have been Democracy Against Domination. I know I have a lot of ideas for retitling, your book, but also that title's already taken, right? Which is perhaps one reason why you didn't call it that. There are many others. But what I mean by that is that the core theoretical account in the book is how welfare institutions can be used by democratic collectives to struggle against domination. And I think I have to talk to you about this more, but there's less talk about freedom and much more talk about a struggle against domination, as if, but yeah, I'm happy to kind of come back to that. So there's this, democratic collective struggling against domination. And so the book doesn't defend a set of abstract political principles, what would an ideal welfare state look like? You don't see that. It also doesn't kind of specify a political program for the struggle against domination, steps X, Y, Z, here's what you should do. The normative dimension of the book, I think, is probably best seen, in my eyes, as a kind of radical reformism, with domination as its target and welfare institutions as its primary mechanism. The question of what exactly is required against this is left open perhaps to the kind of democratic politics that the book advocates. But where, I think, does this theoretical position lead in terms of practical politics? I think there's a kind of either an openness or an ambiguity there. So with the second example of the Swedish feminist movement, which appears in the following chapter on Habermas towards the end of the book, it can, be easy to see an idealized form of Scandinavian social democracy being held up as the kind of political goal. Not explicitly, but there is this kind of idea that might be a strong possibility. And at one point, the book cites Sweden as what a universal social democratic welfare state can and ought to look like. But I don't think it would be fair to say that it succumbs to a form of nostalgia for the historical moment of the post-war settlement. And I would also like to, I don't think my book succumbs to a nostalgia either, but I'm not discussing my book, but I often get that criticism as well. So I'm very much concerned with the future. So the post-war settlement would be, the period with this strong union movement, kind of Keynesian economic policies, relatively high growth, relatively lower levels of inequality. But I don't read this and see a return to the past as either possible nor actually that desirable. As the book shows, the institutions of the welfare state were the result of a compromise between social classes. And the book also acknowledges the ambivalent role of the welfare state within a capitalist society as one that can constrain movements for radical transformation as much as it sometimes enables them. And the welfare state is also one that has kind of reinforced various racialized and gendered hierarchies. So I don't think it's this kind of, make America Sweden again or anything like that. But I think on its own terms, within the own kind of theoretical framework of the book, there is potentially a vulnerability to the classic leftist criticism of social democracy, which is to say that by seeking to merely tame rather than more fundamentally transform capitalist relations, social democratic political projects are kind of inevitably bound to fail. Why? Because capitalists won't tolerate things like a strong welfare state, powerful unions, and an organized workers' movement without actively trying to destroy them. And if we look at the kind of radical edges of social democracy, practices like employee ownership schemes, gradualist plans for nationalization, the kind of historical examples that we might have seen with like the Mitterrand government in the early 80s, the Meidner plan in Sweden, these attempts to kind of achieve partial social ownership in major corporations, all of these were brought to a halt by threatened or actual capital strikes. And so the fear is that with capitalists still in charge of the economy, there are kind of strong limits to what a political democracy can do without capital beginning to refuse to make investments. And so given the enormity of the challenge and the intransience of capitalist relations of production, the radical participatory democracy at the core of the book seems to ask us to take a step further. Namely to think more about economic democracy, to think more about the tyranny of bosses in private firms, and how we might replace these with democratic structures of government and democratic controls being placed over the investment and banking sector. But I think some of these, when it comes down to it, things like democratic controls over workplaces is left a little bit ambiguously open in favor of perhaps more slightly abstract ideas of a kind of open framework for political contest and social movements. So I think there's also a related challenge here to the possible limitations of an approach that takes the state as its primary ground for transformative politics, and the extent to which we might think that there are inherent or intractable problems with a potentially bureaucratic, militaristic, and oppressive apparatus, and what challenges that might pose for social emancipation. But I think this is an issue that my project kind of shares equally with Steven's as well. So perhaps I'll just leave that for others to comment upon if they want to later, or to bring up at a later stage. So my final point relates to the conclusion of the book. I always love the conclusions of books. I read the introduction, conclusion, and you'd be lucky for me to read anything in between, basically. Thankfully for this book, I did read it. So my final point relates to the conclusion, and this here, the author outlines their normative and political vision for politics today. So obviously very exciting stuff. So sometimes I think we can read conclusions as short summaries of the book the author, under different circumstances, might have liked to have written. And I have a new title for this. I have a title for the conclusion. So if the conclusion were to be expanded into a book, and in another world where we had, completely different incentive structures in academia, perhaps there could be a book out there called Social Democracy Beyond the Welfare State. And there's just some, absolutely fascinating reflections in this, as in the rest of the book. So here in the conclusion, the book presents the case for how democratic groups should build a more genuinely democratic and inclusive set of welfare policies. And it starts with the observation that these movements should be led by many of the marginalized groups that were previously excluded from the post-war settlement. Concretely, it calls for an expansion of welfare institutions to include, for example, Medicare for all, or like a nationalized health insurance in the US. It talks about rent caps. Interestingly, it talks about universal childcare and the organization of precarious workers. So although it doesn't explicitly use the term, I think the kinds of policies that are advocated here fit within a framework which in the UK over the past couple of years has gone by the name of universal basic services. And in this conception, essential services should be free at the point of need. And people kind of envision the current NHS basically being radically expanded into other domains. Why not provide free transport, free, basic housing packages, communications equipment, such as maybe a mobile phone or a free broadband. So precisely how far you go depends on the balance of forces and what is, politically feasible at the time. But this idea of this argument for universal basic services to meet human need is about having this expansive political imaginary without necessarily sacrificing the pragmatism of working towards really immediate demands. So I think this is very interesting. And in addition to this idea of expanding the existing welfare services, the book also proposes what it describes as more fundamentally transformative policies. And so the name it gives these is pre-distribution. And this refers to reforms that occur to combat inequality, basically even before the government collects taxes or pays out benefits or things like that. So it's not redistribution after the inequalities have already occurred, but something perhaps vague that kind of happens before that. Now, if you're a UK reader, this might strike you as kind of more Miliband than Corbyn, or perhaps at the worst, just a completely vacuous idea that didn't actually end up amounting to much in the context of when it was first introduced into Labour in the kind of early 2010s. But in the context of the book, it's defined in a much more specific way as an intervention to radically alter the distribution of capital, such that every individual is guaranteed a greater share of productive resources. So I think this is something that we can associate with a much older kind of strand of thought, going back to James Mead in his 1964 book, Efficiency, Equality, and the Ownership of Property. And I think Martin O'Neill is probably the name that most people would think of as someone who's championed this idea as a kind of inspiring new idea for social democrats and something that kind of pushes at those radical edges. So along these lines of this kind of collection of pre-distribution ideas, this attempt to shift the ownership of capital in ways that favor kind of workers and the lower classes, the book proposes schemes such as a sovereign wealth fund, potentially a universal basic income, and capital grants to individuals that when you reach a certain age, you kind of get a social inheritance or something like that from the state. So it kind of puts this out there as like, you know, maybe we could go further still. And I think ultimately the book will end up erring on the side of services over cash grants, precisely because of the perceived greater possibility for the politicization of services, for them to be sites of collective politics. And so, but it's left a little bit open. And at points, I wondered whether this ended up basically being a kind of socialist democracy that dared not speak its name. But I think that it has an interesting kind of theoretical framework that really shows you what an expansive political vision can be. So to conclude my little book presentation, the book opens up a new terrain of thinking about what should really matter in our democracy and what democratic politics should focus on. I think it provides a powerful argument for renewed attention to the sphere of welfare policies and for a struggle for a more democratic and participatory welfare state. So I will now, that's what I got up to the past few days. I'll hand it over to Steven. Yes, I'll hand it over to Steven to talk about my book.
Great, thank you so much, James. I'm like, it's going to be hard to transition because I'm still processing your great and rich comments, and there's so much to them, and I feel like, you know, there's something about hearing your book and your work described back to you where suddenly it feels so much clearer, and you wish you could have expressed it in that way when you actually wrote the thing. So thank you. I feel like your version is the best version. I'm also really excited now to talk about your new book, which comes out today, I believe. So this is tomorrow, so a very auspiciously timed event, obviously not entirely accidental. So congratulations. And it's a book, as I mentioned before, that I've been excited to read for quite a long time. And it lived up to my expectations and indeed exceeded them. And so the book is called Building Power to Change the World, the Political Thought of the German Council Movement. And so I'm going to give both a summary of the book, kind of overview, a preview of the argument, and also raise some questions that I actually do think intersect in interesting ways with some of the questions that you raised about my book as well. So it's a real pleasure and a challenge to comment on James's book, Building Power to Change the World, the Political Thought of the German Council Movement. It's a pleasure because the book provides a truly remarkable and incisive reconstruction of the intricate debate about socialism and democracy that arose in the wake of the German and Russian revolutions. A challenge, however, because that debate was intricate, and so I can hardly do justice to James's argument. And so I'm going to just highlight some of the key points and contributions that the book makes to political theory, and then we're going to raise a few questions about the book. But I think probably similar to your questions, James, there are questions about the book that are speaking more to questions, political questions that kind of keep me up at night or make me worry about my own work. And so it also, I think, is a point of intersection between some of the concerns you also raise about my work. So James's book is an act of historical recovery, one that in the tradition of the Cambridge School uses history to denaturalize our present political arrangements. And so this speaks also to James's point about sort of what, how, and this is, I think, a conversation that would be interesting to have, how we both deploy historical research to make a contribution to political theory. And so in the case of this book, James seeks to denaturalize our current horizon of electoral or parliamentary democracy and to recover the alternative that arose during those heady days following the collapse, in particular, of the German imperial government at the end of World War I. So it's an act of recovery and denaturalization. But more than that, James breathes life into those debates. And so what really makes it such a remarkable and exciting book is the sense that we are sort of learning about what are in many ways, I mean, I think debates that many in political theory have a sort of vague sense of, we're seeing the kind of depth and richness and nuance of this debate that happened after World War I about council democracy, and seeing how it speaks to concerns that are very much salient today, both within political theory and in politics more generally. And in this way, the book contributes to the burgeoning literature on what you can call socialist republicanism. So one of the other moves the book makes that really is very productive is examining how these socialist thinkers and activists drew on and enriched a larger tradition of democratic Republican theorizing. So they deployed language that echoed earlier Republican concerns and theorists, but first of all, with a much more democratic emphasis, but also with a socialist political horizon. And so while each chapter is organized around a specific thinker, so the three thinkers that James really engages with is Anton Pannekoek, whose name I tried to learn how to pronounce and I'm surely butchering right now, Karl Kautsky, and Rosa Luxemburg. But in addition to engaging with these theorists, each of the chapters is also organized around a specific concept within political thought and within Republican political thought. So freedom, power, organization, and civic virtue. And so there's a really productive dialogue, an interesting dialogue between the historical reconstruction of the thinkers and then these larger conceptual categories that help guide those reconstructions. And in all, Muldoon, or James, at some point in my comments, I'm going to switch to Muldoon, I think, argues that these reflections on council democracy reveals an alternative model of politics. And it's one that in political theory and in debates about politics, we might be familiar through the literature on participatory democracy or deliberative democracy. But what's really great about these council democrats, in contrast to our supposed radical democrats in political theory, is the way in which they're essentially focused on issues of power and mass mobilization. And so what all these theorists sought to do is to combine this focus on mobilization with much more concrete reflection on the sort of institutional forms that a socialist democracy could take. And so I'm going to just give a brief overview of the book and then raise what I take to be sort of, for me at least, the questions that kind of left me burning with desire to hear more about maybe pushing you to venture beyond the historical reconstruction to articulating some of your own views on some of the controversies that are played out within the book. So James begins with the emergence of the workers and soldiers' councils after World War I, with political power collapsing under the weight of the disastrous war, with political legitimacy collapsing under the weight of the disastrous war. These councils formed spontaneously throughout Russia and Germany, and they basically were suddenly tasked with running the country in many cases. And I'll just say as a footnote here, one thing I'd love to hear more about is the day-to-day operation of these councils and how the participants within them balance their administrative questions with their larger political goals. So this is mentioned a few times in the book, that there are kind of these realizations within the councils that, that, okay, we actually do need to delegate and maybe have some bodies that are smaller to run some of these administrative tasks. And so one of the things that's so fascinating about the councils is the way in which participants in them were grappling with some of these fundamental political questions on their own. Then the core of the book is an engagement with the three key theorists of the council movement. So two, I think, are maybe more familiar as participants in this debate, Anton Pannekoek and Rosa Luxemburg. And then the third is Karl Kautsky. And I'm going to say, and I said this already to James, that I thought Kautsky was the surprising hero of the book. And one of the major achievements of the book is to revise the standing of Kautsky, scraping away the crust of the polemics that have surrounded his thought. As such a central theorist of Marxist and socialist thought in the late 19th and early 20th century, it's so hard to read him without those polemics in mind. Is he a determinist? Is he a parliamentarian? And I think a great achievement of the book, I just came away from the book with a deep sympathy to him as a political theorist. And I think he should be read more seriously among political theorists as an important thinker in his own right. But then in Muldoon's hands, each of these theorists contributes to larger debates within political theory. And so again, one of the strengths of the book, and one of the things that really makes it, kind of gives it a propulsive feeling, is the way that each chapter uses the thought of this theorist to challenge various other views within political theory. And most essentially, a kind of dialogue with the neo-Republican, more liberal neo-Republican theory of someone like Pettit and others, who think of themselves as not really liberals, but essentially it's liberalism with a little bit more democracy or a little bit more participation, but I think ultimately a kind of liberal view of freedom in the end. So first, according to James, Pennicook presents an important theorization of the relationship between council democracy and freedom. So for him, councils embody freedom as an activity and not as a condition or a status. And so freedom requires active self-determination through participation in common affairs. And so this appears to be close to a positive view of freedom, where participation in politics is necessary to the realization of freedom. But according to Muldoon, this isn't quite the case, as theorists like Pennicook are not concerned with autonomous self-control or self-mastery, but with the collective overcoming of our impediments to freedom. And so this is actually, I think, also a moment where our arguments really intersect. There's kind of this idea that the activity of realizing the goal has to be achieved negatively through challenging these structures of domination. And it's through challenging the domination that people come to view themselves as agents rather than passive individuals. So this is not a matter of our internal psychological states, but of how freedom is manifested in the world. And furthermore, the key goal is not participation as such, but collective control over our collective institutions. And so this is where these theorists of council democracy differ from Hannah Arendt, and where James has a real issue with Arendt, is they were still strategically thinking about how they could transform larger structures of democracy. So unlike Arendt, they didn't see kind of the participation in the council movement as being the end goal in its own right. And so while these theorists were advocates of participation in democracy, unlike many subsequent participatory Democrats, they were also socialists. And so for them, these micro-level questions of participation had to be connected to the larger questions of organizing the power of workers. And so Muldoon next examines the conception of power used in these debates, showing how for its advocates, council democracy wasn't really the end goal in itself, but rather was meant to be a mechanism that helps contribute to the larger organization of power among workers. But it's also here that we start seeing the first fissures within the book. And some of the, I think, unresolved debates that I get the sense James himself struggles with and doesn't have maybe a fully resolved position on. And this is the debate, and really it's a debate between Kautsky and Luxemburg, about the autonomy of the organization and the activity of the masses vis-a-vis both formal parties, but in particular vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis parliamentary institutions. Which brings us to what I thought was the most intriguing chapter of the book, where Muldoon examines Kautsky as a theorist of socialist republicanism. So if you've engaged in debates in political theory that surround these issues, you kind of know Kautsky as the person everyone attacks, and basically is like, everyone tries to relegate to being the retrograde, the worst of Second International Marxism. So he's simultaneously too deterministic, too much a believer in kind of historical materialism, but also then too parliamentarian and too bourgeois. So he's kind of like a paradoxical figure. On the one hand, he's both too radical and too passive. And so this has given rise to phrases like radical waiting or radical passivism. So this idea that you're so invested in the inevitability of the revolution that you don't feel like you have to do anything to realize it, because you just have to kind of keep the Socialist Party alive until the moment is ripe for the revolution. And that is how most people read Kautsky, I think. But what Muldoon reveals is a much more dynamic thinker, and in particular a thinker who really was engaged with what the council movement meant for socialism. And he's one who envisions a complementary role for parliamentary democracy, municipal decentralization, and decentralized, not planning necessarily, but kind of coordinated social production, and then direct participation through these various councils. And what I found really interesting in this chapter were Kautsky's critiques of the ideal of full council democracy. And in particular, he worried that on their own, councils risk becoming exclusionary. They risk privileging a small segment of workers and soldiers, those with the ability and time to actively participate in the councils. And in contrast, Kautsky thought that universal suffrage, even if it provided a weaker form of participation, could actually be more inclusive of these groups that might not participate in the councils. So I'm going to return to this. This is one of the big questions I have. Muldoon then ends with a careful engagement with Rosa Luxemburg's thought, who no doubt is the most, I'd say, well-remembered theorist to emerge from these council debates. And Muldoon tries to shift focus when it comes to Luxemburg's thought and emphasize her concern with questions of civic virtue and use this as a way, again, to situate her in this larger Republican tradition. And so she helps us see the crucial role that mass mobilization and struggle and participation in these councils could play from a pedagogical perspective, how it could help individuals come to see themselves as active participants in public life rather than passive or obedient. And so for Luxemburg, the power and participation of the masses was not enough. They also needed to overcome their habituation to obedience in the factory and see themselves as authors of their collective life. And I'll just say one sub-thread of the book is a critique of Lenin and Lenin's critique of the councils. And this really comes out in the engagement with Luxemburg, because while Lenin praised the discipline of the factory as a precondition for socialist mobilization, Luxemburg sought to distinguish between the self-imposed conscious discipline of participants in mass politics and the external discipline of the industrial production system. And so what we get in the end is a sense of the richness and depth of this relatively forgotten debate about democracy. And what really makes it so, I think, alive and remarkable is that this was a debate that arose at a moment when the question of what form democracy should take was a genuinely unsettled question. It was genuinely unclear if Germany was going to become a parliamentary democracy or a hybrid democracy. I think it was relatively unlikely it was going to become a full council democracy, but I think there's a lot of momentum behind some sort of hybridization of council and parliamentary democracy. But I have some questions. I mean, really, I have one big question. I mean, this is a question that I feel like runs through the whole book. And I just want to hear, James, I'm going to try to pin you down on this question. Are councils a supplement to parliamentary democracy or a substitution for parliamentary democracy? And so on the one side, you see people like Luxemburg and Pinnacook, who both seem to see it as the councils as something like a self-contained alternative to parliamentary democracy. But then you have Kautsky, who really seem to have an interesting view that we can have a kind of hybridization that takes the best of both of these systems. So parliamentary democracy being more inclusive, maybe more liable to kind of protect individual liberties. But he was also very aware that there was a tendency towards elitism and cliquishness. I mean, he was part of the great split in the socialist delegation in the Reichstag over the war bonds vote. So he saw firsthand the pathologies of parliamentary democracy, joined the independent socialists in protest over that. And so he thought that the councils could be a mechanism for kind of alternative modes of participation that could exert pressure and counteract this tendency towards elitism. So where do you stand? And in particular, what do you think of Kautsky's democratic concerns about the councils, about the fact that they could be easily captured by particular segments of the working class, that they would not be as genuinely inclusive and universal as parliamentarian democracy, even as parliamentarian democracy creates this pathological side effect of elitism and exclusion. And so relatedly, I think it flows very much into the question, and this is a question I think, again, that's an intersection between both of our books, which is who is the agent of revolutionary politics? And one thing that also really struck me in the debate between, you could say, the full council versus hybridization, is Kautsky actually has a kind of nuanced vision of class and the role that class plays in politics. So he doesn't have as much an idea that there's a kind of homogenous working class that is just waiting to realize itself through political mobilization. He's worried about the divisions within the working class and how some more privileged workers might assert their interests at the expense of other groups. And so he's, in his political thought, he's worried about how do you coordinate different segments of the working class to avoid these pathologies of particularism and you could say partiality. And on the other hand, it seems like in the background for the more pro-council side, they tend to have a more class in itself versus class for itself kind of framework, where there is a kind of organic working class interest that through civic virtue and through participation in the councils will eventually arise. And if you have that view, then you don't have to worry as much about these questions about exclusion and so on, because the councils will kind of organically end up expressing the collective interests of workers through the process of mobilization and so forth. So I think that, again, it was just very fascinating to me to see Kautsky almost becoming a skeptic on class, this question of class unity, because again, he's so associated with Second International Marxism and those questions. And I think I raise both these issues because they obviously, I think, speak to the last domain that I want to push you on. So your work is more situated within kind of Cambridge School style intellectual history, where the role of history is to denaturalize the present. But I think there's also a question of sort of to what extent are these thinkers also bound by their historical moment or the historical assumptions of thinking at that moment. And so, they're writing at a time at which, in Germany, the unity of the working class was generated by exclusion from politics, so by the three-tiered suffrage system in Prussia. There was a kind of heightened class consciousness. And of course, today I would say, arguably do not have the same historical conditions. And so I think this question of who is the agent of democracy becomes really important for whether or not we can sort of bring these ideas into the present or how we bring them into the present. And similarly, I think this question of sort of, is this a two-track model where we try to kind of work within the state and then also agitate from outside? Is that what you're calling for? Or are you, or is one of the conclusions of their thought a kind of much deeper skepticism about the potential of radical transformation to occur through the state? And so the idea that we need to kind of construct these new alternative democratic institutions outside the state and act through those. So those are, I think, the questions. I think those are very much questions that lie at the intersection of both of our books. But I just want to reiterate, and this goes to some of the things you're saying about history, like if you want a model for doing historically engaged political theory and drawing into these debates figures that have been neglected or misread, I think you can find few better models than building power to change the world. So it was a pleasure to read and comment on it.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I enjoyed that I got called Muldoon at different points in the book. I like that kind of Cambridge school style, like as if I could be a figure potentially of world historical importance. Yes. So I appreciate that. It's like when students say Professor Muldoon, and I never correct them. I never correct them. So thank you very much, Stephen, for those comments. Now, to make it a dialogue, a true deliberation, if you will, should I have a few words and then you have a few words and then we open it up for discussion? That was kind of the plan, right?
Yeah, that was the plan. It's getting on. I wonder, though, if we take questions, just given I don't want to
Yeah, fair call.
But take a couple questions and we could kind of respond to the questions and...
Okay, well, why don't we ask people to either post the questions in the chat or to write in the chat, I've got a question, and then we can open it up to them. Does that work for you?
Yeah, and if it takes a while, we can also start. Okay. I also reflect I also need
to chill?
Collect my thoughts.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, I'm happy to go first and just kind of respond to some of the things you've said while people are kind of mulling over some of the issues. Just to get a bit of banter going. So like you raised so many interesting questions. I just want to briefly start with the question of like, what did the councils do? What was their day-to-day operation? Because that's a question I often get. And I think like one of the main, gripes that the council members had was that as soon as they kind of were in this position of dual power, they were kind of completely swamped with everyday administrative duties of basically like governing the country, of dealing with people's concerns. Remember also that like councils usually are arising in wartime situations. So times at which the country's economy is in tatters, that supply chains are ruined, that people have all kinds of issues. And I'd also want to point people to the work of one of my colleagues, Gard Ketz, who edited a book with me on the German Revolution. He's actually done even, much more in-depth archival work, basically going city to city and looking at the minute meetings of all the councils. And so he's doing some really great work in his PhD, which I'm hoping will be out soon. But one of the councils that we looked at together was the Hamburg Council. And what we found was that it's just a really different situation in each city. So there's no kind of universal experience of councils. In Hamburg, for instance, there is basically one of the big questions, well, what is the relationship between the councils and the old institutions of the Senate and the Citizens Council? And the workers' councils come out and they're like, okay, we're abolishing those, they're over now, we're in charge. And a couple of days later, they basically realize they don't have the technical skills to run a lot of this, so they kind of bring them back in. Which kind of shows you a lot of the ambiguities and the confusions that are happening at the time. And in particular, there's a lot of questions and openness around questions of democratic inclusion. Who can be on a council? Who can have a council? And you hear some of the council delegates kind of scoffing at the idea that there could be landlord councils and councils for the bourgeoisie, and they're like, no, councils are workers' councils. But there are quite genuine issues that aren't about that kind of thing. So what about unemployed people? What about peasants and people working in rural locations, even people outside of highly organized large-scale factories, and perhaps most importantly, women? For example, GARD turns our attention to the fact that the Hamburg Council actually gets a petition from a women's group being like, can we have representation? Are we able to have a women's council, or perhaps participate in some way in this council? And this issue is really kind of sidelined. It's really not dealt with appropriately, and all of these issues are kind of treated in a very haphazard kind of manner. So councils, different experiences in different areas, and there's a lot of kind of ambiguity about what exactly is going on. I thought I did have a positive view of freedom. But maybe not, maybe I don't. I'm pretty committed to the idea that, that participation is, an essential aspect of freedom, and that some form of self-determining society would require some kind of active participation from broad sections of the citizenry.
If I read the person that denied that, then I was misspeaking, because I read you as having a kind of modified positive view of freedom. So positive but collective, and so it's not about self-mastery or autonomy, but about
yes, that is true. So I don't see it as a kind of Aristotelian self-realization. I think it is true that it's like so it's collective political freedom, not a kind of realizing the best version of yourself or something like that. So it can be distinguished from that idea of positive freedom. Just to fold some of the questions from the chat in as well, I mean, I'm going to briefly just lump Stephen here with me, but I really see both Stephen and myself as kind of quite in the in and against the state idea, which has become quite big in the US or in the UK in particular over the past 4 years. So this idea of working within political parties, but also outside of them, such that I don't know, this is something that I got a lot in your book, Stephen, that there's this need to build a movement to hold some kind of, elected officials accountable. I mean, for me, I was very excited by Corbynism, right? So my time is done and gone. I'm, about to be buried in the political wasteland back from whence I came. But that's definitely, that's definitely the kind of politics that I associate myself with. Eric in the comments, but yeah, Stephen can obviously speak for himself. In relation to democratic theory, I kind of set the position out in the introduction to my book, Council Democracy. Much more concerned with questions of economic democracy, which I think really get sidelined in the radical democracy project, and perhaps even more so in the deliberative democracy one. But just to briefly move on some of these important questions. So Stephen raised this question of, are the councils a supplement to political democracy, to the kind of representative institutions, or are they a replacement or substitution for it? So the historical positions, I think, are clear, right? So Kautsky thinks they're a supplement, Luxemburg thinks they're a replacement. I don't know. I started off this book and I was very keen on council democracy, but this was years ago. It was years and years ago. And so I think the path that I've taken is from super interest in council democracy to gradually realizing that some of these criticisms raised by people like Kautsky and many others are quite difficult to refute, right? There's this real sense within some of the council Democrats writing, people like Pannekoek, And so Rosa Luxemburg is like, it's hard to associate her as a council Democrat because the institutions themselves only really arise towards the very, very end of her life. And so she supports them when they arise, but she doesn't have, you know, heaps of theoretical reflections on them. She kind of has programmatic calls for them to replace existing bourgeois institutions. But it's really people like Richard Müller and Ernst Dömig and Pannekoek that are kind of doing a lot of the theoretical work. And there's a lot of issues with some of Pannekoek's writings, in my opinion, that like there's a lot of arguments that kind of see this almost like a ontological difference between a council institution and a parliamentary one, that a parliamentary institution will be a talking shop, which will, you know, get nothing done, that a council institution will have all these positive qualities associated with it, that will have a kind of proletarian character, which seems to me a little bit kind of outside of a concrete analysis of the balances of forces within particular institutions. Like some parliaments at particular historical junctures will be quite bad. They might be talking shows. The real power might lay elsewhere, but it doesn't seem to my mind that there's this kind of essential difference between the two. And so one of Kautsky's lines is, you know, do people not give long speeches in council meetings as well? Like, it's not just parliaments that might have, you know, characteristics about them that we might find negative. What's my position on it? Well, we're not living in the German Revolution, so who cares what I think about it? I'm, you know, supportive of the kind of programs that you're supportive of, Stephen. I find very little to criticize about these kinds of ideas of expanding universal basic services, of establishing a kind of minimum income support for people. These kinds of tried and tested, you know, like long-standing ideas on the left. Like, I'm not a very unorthodox leftist in many regards, and I don't feel like I have any kind of super insights into, you know, reviving some kind of magical workers' councils that are, you know, are long gone. I do think we should establish, you know, like democratic controls over workplaces and over investment and banking sector, but there are like interesting ways that we can go about that don't necessarily go back to this kind of male breadwinner workers' council kind of thing. So finally, this idea about denaturalizing the present, to what extent I think is a two-track model. So I don't know if I'm calling for anything. I don't know if there's much use of academic calling for things from their home in Islington and then going out and walking their sausage dogs and like being like, yeah, I've politically acted today. But I think it's like, I think what's really important is basically just engaging in this concrete project of building power, of like supporting institutions that are, you know, going to be effective in this struggle. And that's basically, you know, a lot of what I do now is about trying to support other people building these kinds of organizations up, supporting the discourse and the kind of development of these things where I can. I've talked enough, so I'm going to read the comments and I'll let you jump in, Stephen, and perhaps we can start to open up to even more questions and for other people to start talking as well.
I'm going to answer questions on your behalf as well.
Oh, perfect. Do that.
Because Hans Atzenbaum asks kind of about where this book situates itself within the kind of larger democratic theory world. And I mean, one of the things I would just like about the book is its engagement with socialist thought, and it's kind of just sidestepping post-Marxism in, I think, a productive way, right? And so you have this kind of narrative, which is you had Second International Marxism, which was basically just deterministic. And so now we have, you know, in reaction to that, we need a theory of post-Marxist agency that, you know, ranging from Laclau-Mouffe to Hart and Negri and all of these various positions that are out there. And I see your book as kind of a robust effort to say, like, look, no, these people we think of as kind of reducing the political to the economic actually had these very complex and sophisticated accounts of politics and of the state and of democracy. And it wasn't just, you know, oh, solve class domination and politics disappears. And so I think your book is clearly building on methodologically building on kind of the Republican approach to the history of political thought, which is kind of use these earlier debates as resources. But there's a way in which I also see you as kind of like an institutions and power from within socialism kind of book. I mean, that's what maybe that's my bias, but that's part of what I took from the book, that like, we can look to the socialist tradition and, for insights about power and the state that go beyond the state being a tool of the bourgeois and go beyond, organizing workers. And there's actually a much more complex story there. And, these earlier socialist thinkers were very concerned with kind of core political questions. And so I see it as kind of socialist republicanism in the sense if it's, looking to socialist thinkers for accounts of core political issues. And then, my position on democratic theory here. Yeah, so I mean, I also think I'm kind of coming out of a bit of a backlash to radical democratic theory. And you may have picked up on this a little bit, James, like I think the book is my effort to overcome Foucauldian and various other kind of so-called radical democratic views that I just find are inadequate for thinking about the reality of power and the state, and what's going on in the state, and create a false opposition between statist institutionalism and anti-institutional formless politics, and it's just not a satisfying account of how that should work. I was also just going to mention, Paul, in answer to your question, so I do engage a little bit with the community action programs in the US. In the conclusion, in the book I would have written if I had, as James said, operated under better conditions. I think that to me is a really key example of similar dynamics. And there's actually recently been really interesting revisionist history on the community action programs that say they were much more successful and long lasting than people gave them credit for. And so that is one of the kind of few bright points I point to from within the American context of kind of this intersection between democratic social movements and social welfare programs. And what's also interesting in the community action programs is you see this really clear split between a kind of liberal paternalistic idea that these participation in the welfare state should help people become, better at budgeting. I mean, this was part of the idea of the community action was like, we're going to teach these poor people how to budget by making them run their own welfare programs. But then a lot of these community action programs became like hotbeds of Black nationalist activism, of the welfare rights movement. I mean, they kind of, again, much like in the Bismarck case, exceeded that more disciplinary intention and became modes or moments for advancing a more social movement vision of democracy. And look, so yes, James, there's an ambiguity, James, in the book between trying to make people feel, to kind of answer a certain set of critiques of the welfare state model while also holding on to something more radical. And so I think you're just picking up on that tension in your comments about sort of how far do I want to push? Where do I want to, is this a defensive social, is this putting the democracy in social democracy, or is it democracy beyond social democracy? And so I think that is just a tension in all of my thinking about this, where on the one hand, I don't want people to forget the historical political struggles that were behind social democracy, but I also don't want people to be naive about sort of the limits of those historical achievements. But I wanted to say two things in response to some of your questions about the first and the last question. So on the last, look, I think one of the signs that this is a work of political theory is I don't actually really advocate for a policy position overall. I mean, a lot of what I'm trying to say is how should we evaluate competing policies? And part of what I just want to do in the book is say we need to focus less on the kind of ideal requirements of justice or equality that those policies might realize, and more on the way those policy designs might relate to questions of democratic mobilization and social mobilization. So I don't think I'm necessarily advocating predistribution, or, I'm more sympathetic to universal services for sure. I think there's a lot in predistribution debates that I find I'm very sympathetic to, but I just don't know that I'm advocating for those policies. I'm more saying if we're going to advocate for those policies, we have to be looking at how and when they can enable democratic mobilization, democratic agency. I'm going to stop. I have thoughts about the history and theory thing, but why don't I stop there and we can open it up again.
Yeah, so we had Lillian who was going to ask a question.
Hi, I'm really excited about both your books. I have a question about the overall kind of project. the idea of socialist republicanism. And it's just about the general problem and like the kind of institutional separation between the state and the economy in a capitalist society, and in what way like thinking with and against social democracy is helping us to like resolve this problem. So the reason that I'm asking this is that the first thing I thought of when thinking, and I haven't read the book obviously, but the first question I have about like workers' councils is that the councils today in Germany, to the extent of my knowledge, are like pretty different than the councils that were going on in 1918. And I have a friend who's doing some research into the role that the workers' councils actually play in the past 3 recessions. And he's coming around to the conclusion, and he might not be right about this, I'm just throwing it out there, that it's actually like the workers' councils really tail the strength of the trade unions in being able to retain concessions from capital. So it's actually like the centralization of the industrial sector, like the centralized bargaining, that is able to kind of weather the storm for the German working class in a way that's significantly different. Like it's not having the same kind of jobless recoveries or whatever as other economies. And this is like, and someone raised the question about the US context, like there's a myriad of problems why the working class is so weak there, but one of them is that it's never achieved any kind of sectoral bargaining agreements, like regionally or across industries or whatever. So like this, I feel like one of the thing that kind of came across to me is that like the workers' councils start playing this kind of role of like, you know, politicizing the economy in a way that's recognizable to a political theorist. And they have very robust ideas about this. Like, but what if it's also true that the more economistic side of the socialist movement is like, you know, the strength of force in a certain sense. And like, I'm not advocating for like economism or whatever, but it does seem to pose a kind of problem that in order to think with and against social democracy, you have to think about like the way that capital continues to put pressure on these political institutions, and people are like, you know, like the burden is entirely on them to keep them alive. And it seems like these kind of the more stodgier, like economist, like the stodgier parts of the socialist movement, for better or worse, have been able to kind of like weather the storm a little better. So much so that like one of my students suggested to me after reading an Eric Olin Wright paper, she was working at a trade union in Germany this summer, and she was like, the councils seem to me like they might have like contradictory class locations. Like often they side with management and play a very reactionary role depending on the context. So there's a way in which like I'm trying to figure out like with and against the state, which I'm won over to that kind of perspective. Whoa. Like what kind of like institution, I mean, like, are you thinking like locally? Are you thinking across sectors, regionally? Because the shop by shop like council movement, I'm not convinced it has that kind of staying power, or it might not.
Yeah, really, really interesting point. So I think the first thing to do is to say that the kinds of works councils that they have now, I think it's called Betriebsräte, the ones that currently exist in Germany, are completely different to the workers and soldiers councils that arose in 1918. And basically, as they were being transformed from the first to the second, you know, a lot of the more radical council delegates became completely disillusioned with the very disempowered role that they came to play in German society. So I think there is a super strong contrast between the two, just as we wouldn't say that the councils that kind of become incorporated into the one-party structure of the Soviet Union, they're not the same as the, you know, the organic councils that arose during the revolution. So there is this difference here. In terms of what a socialist republican program would be like, though, so this, I think it's a kind of socialist democracy. I think that's how Kautsky and others of the same ilk envisioned it. So the idea is that big industries would be taken over by the state, it was a kind of form of nationalization, and the individual workplaces would be able to elect delegates in what would end up kind of looking like a federal pyramid structure. And if you look at diagrams that existed of people that you know, like Richard Müller, who were drawing them at the time, they do kind of end up resembling this kind of pyramidal model that, oh, sorry, what is that? This pyramid model that or even Hannah Arendt kind of talks about in her book, right? So there are local councils that kind of elect delegates to regional councils, and that kind of leads up to national bodies. So how this would have all worked in practice, and you know, I share some of your, you know, skepticism about this. It never really got fully realized, right? It never, like, no one had a chance to see 10 years down the track how things would look. Like, there are a lot of sketches on the back of napkins, a lot of things happened that, you know, in the spur of the moment. That's not to say that there isn't something really interesting there. And I think Arendt's insight that there is this kind of like, you know, the institutions that people form in these moments of crisis where they're searching for like democratic governance do tend to resemble a lot of these key characteristics. Like, I don't think that is a weird political naturalism. I think that there is a kind of insight there that can be reproduced in the digital age. But what that would look like in practice, I think, is a more open question. Yeah, Stephen?
Can I push you as well? Because I feel like this is actually a nice segment to also respond to Vincent Harding's question about the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because there's an interesting thread through your book as well about sort of, you know, here's this epochal phrase from Marx, and what are you supposed to do with it? And so I feel like there kind of are, so the question is, you know, to what extent is the legitimacy of the workers' councils that they are a kind of form of temporary class rule, and so their exclusionary nature might be justified in that respect. And maybe you can also just say a little bit about how in the book sort of there's this sub-debate going on between Lenin, Luxemburg, Kautsky about what we think of that term in Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and if that can be realized on the basis of Republican principles.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I was about to respond to that, to Vincent's great question there, because I mean, to someone like Kautsky and the kind of more moderate section of the USPD, the dictatorship of the proletariat means nothing more than a workers' government being democratically elected and essentially socializing private capital. I mean, that's kind of what it is. And the schism that opens up between Russian communism and German social democracy is really on this point of the dictatorship and what that means. And I think when Kautsky starts to become this kind of like old crank who's just writing page after page of anti-Bolshevik kind of material, it's really on the kind of historical outcomes of the Russian Revolution that this is, you know, starts to be about. Like, it's an opposition to, you know, actual dictatorship, to the kind of dictatorship that involves secret police and banning other socialist parties and making sure that, you know, it's only you who is represented in positions of political power in the state. That's the kind of dictatorship that people like Kautsky were opposed to. And essentially, if you need greater than democratic means for someone like him, if you don't have a democratic majority, then you don't have the political power to rule. And I think this is kind of one of the differences, because for some socialists, the very institutions of bourgeois democracy are themselves skewed so heavily in favor of the capitalist class that it would be naive to think that you could kind of ever generate a victory on their own terms. Because if anyone ever gets close, you know, there'd be a whole, you know, power of the capitalist class would be brought against you if it ever looked like you were, you know, in the position to like legitimately gain democratic power, you know, slowly appropriate them in the very kind of like considered way that Kautsky had intended, you know, a slow, gradualist form of socialization. You know, for him, he was even talking about compensating them, of like paying for the factories and things like that, because he was worried about what a capital strike would look like, and he was worried about the German economy being crippled. And I think this is a genuine question for any socialist, which is, how do you strip power from someone who has it all? What does that look like? I mean, what if they just self-sabotage? What if they press the self-destruct button and cripple the economy? Because there are many historical examples where that's precisely what the capitalist class did at the slightest sign that something would happen. So I think they're a really interesting question. I'd love to hear what either Stephen or someone else in the Zoom would have to say about those as well.
This whole conversation between you and Lillian and then about the dictatorship of the proletariat also relates back to your kind of question earlier to me about sort of what are the limits of my vision? How far, can the welfare state go in challenging the separation between the political and the economic? And I just sort of, part of me is just like throws my hands up and say like, yeah, you're right. Like, I don't have an argument. I get trapped between sort of my historical inclinations, which is just to kind of look at what has existed historically and try to see the glimmers of an alternative, kind of an anti-utopian utopianism, and then also just wanting to advocate for whatever policies I want to advocate for. And so I think, this is a methodological issue that I've been stuck on, and it has to do with what you've been talking about earlier. And yeah, I just think, the most we can look to are the glimmers of achievements that might challenge the limits of the current settlement and just say, look, this happened then. Maybe we should continue trying that. I think this also has to do with the role of theory and history in thinking about politics. It's like just saying we need X, it's not going to, so part of my methodology and part of why I like using the history is it puts some flesh and it creates a kind of usable set of reference points for these debates that go beyond just here's my utopian end goal and hoping that we can realize that. So that's part of where I think I both agree with all these skeptical questions, but say, look, we just have to look to the traces of the alternatives that have existed throughout history and sort of keep the flame alive. And that's the best we can do.
Yeah, I think I'm more or less on the same page with you in that regard. I kind of wish that my book, I wish I had the courage to write more theory into the book, but I think in the end, it just became too much of a challenge to try and support this really deep historical research on the one hand, and then make all these strong normative claims. And I'm not that good at it. So I think I tended to go for the history over the theory side. So I admire the way your book is able to balance the two in a much more even-handed way. So I think, sorry, Stephen.
Not doing justice to either of them, though. That's what
yeah. So I think that the crowd is kind of speaking. They're telling us that they've loved the event. It's been wonderful, fantastic.
My book before we wrap up as well.
Oh, please do. Yes.
I think I'm excited to see yours in the flesh, and they are prohibitively, or at least mine is prohibitively expensive. I acknowledge. So my pitch to people, and I would say for both the books, if you want to read it and you ask your library to buy it. If you can buy it, that's amazing. But at the very least, the more it can be widely available, I think the better. But yeah, I wanted to get I've been living in the US for a while now, so I want to get my salesman moment.
Yeah, definitely. Go. Yeah, this is what Katsky was all about, selling books. Okay, well, let's wrap it up there. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's such a pleasure and really such an honor to have people engage with your work and hear about it. And I was so happy to have Stephen, engage with us and have this book dialogue. So yeah, it's just been fantastic. Stephen, I think, shall we wrap it up?
Yeah, also, I just want to say thank you to Autonomy as well for helping host and organize the event, and also hopefully contributing to building the mass constituencies that could realize some of these very abstract ideals.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to seeing you at some time in a post-pandemic world, somewhere in the world. Maybe, I don't know, Italy. Let's say Italy. Let's meet in Italy. Ciao, ciao. I'll just hang around in the room, so I'll just awkwardly be standing here, but you can leave if you want.
Say goodbye.
Well done. Well done, you
thank
guys.
you, Jeannie. Thanks, Paul. Woo woo.
Thank you, everyone. I also, just appreciate everyone coming.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll wrap up the session soon. All that's left now is the people that have basically just turned their screens off and kind of walked away to like have dinner or look after their kids or something.
Oh, but thank you so much for that conversation and your comments on the book. It was it was
good. It was a good chance to actually read a book properly. Usually I'm like, book. So yeah, it is. It's good to be like to